Alright, welcome everyone to the first English ACT video out of some amount of videos. This one's on comma rules, which is a big one because the ACT English can kind of be divided up into three subtopics or categories: production of writing, knowledge of language, and conventions of standard English, which doesn't mean anything, but the conventions of standard English, aka grammar, is actually more than half of the test. Which is why commas are important, comma rules are important, because they're a big part of grammar, and grammar is a big part of the test. The other thing I'll say about the English test, and maybe the reading test as well, is that you kind of build this understanding of what should go where and how things fit together based on 17 years of reading stuff. So like the best way to learn grammar essentially is just to read anything and build your internal monologue that way versus looking up grammar can only get you so far, so I'll just leave you with that. And the last thing I'll say in general is that commas are used to separate things in a sentence. It's just the bottom line. But let's see how in-depth we can go on where and when to use them. So the first case that we'll look at is introductions. I just decided to call it that, but basically what I'm trying to say is anything in the beginning of a sentence, such as a participial phrase or a dependent clause, and if you don't know what that means, don't sweat it. Anything in the beginning of a sentence that can't stand on its own should be set off from the rest of the actual sentence with commas. So let's look at a few examples.
All right, looking at 36. Remember that we said if you have anything in the beginning of a sentence that couldn't stand on its own, it should be put off with a comma. So if we look at 36, we read it as is, it would say, as the limestone eroded, caves formed. Now already that kind of sounds awkward in my own internal monologue, but it's also grammatically incorrect because this introductory thing, as the limestone eroded, isn't set off from the actual sentence. This is the actual sentence right here. Caves formed. As short as it is, we still have a subject and we still have a verb. And that's all you need for a sentence. So we have caves formed as our complete sentence. And then as the limestone eroded, that's just additional information to add on to our sentence caves formed. So the correct answer in this case would be as the limestone eroded, comma, caves formed, which would be H. All right, now on to titles. So we talked about introductions. This is titles. I want you to work out 63 on your own. So pause the video, figure out what your instinct is, and then come back. So ready, set, pause. Cool. So talking about titles, this just means like anything you have before, anything you have describing a person that you're talking about, such as we have right here. So American agriculturalist Carrie Fowler. That whole thing is its own noun. American agriculturalist Carrie Fowler. In the same sense that President Barack Obama, that's its own individual thing. So if I said President Barack Obama spearheaded the creation of the seed vault, it becomes a little bit more clear that you don't need this comma after Carrie Fowler. So this whole thing, they try to confuse students by making it super long, but the thing to keep in mind is that it's its own noun. Like if I just replace this whole thing with just the first name Carrie, that's equally as valid. But now if I read it, it's so much clearer that you don't need the comma. Carrie spearheaded the creation of the seed vault in 2006 versus American agriculturalist Carrie Fowler spearheaded blah, 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 blah. So you actually don't need the comma with a title such as what we have here. So the correct answer in this case is D.
All right, moving on to relative clauses, appositives, and interrupters. So this will take a little bit of explaining, but the basic idea is that any extra information or additional information outside of what the main idea of the sentence is saying, if you have extra information in a sentence, it should always go sandwiched between two commas. And on the other side of that, if you read a sentence that has two commas marking off part of the sentence, you should be able to remove that part of the sentence without changing the meaning of the sentence. So anything that's additional to the main idea of the sentence, anything that adds additional information should always be marked off with two commas to indicate that if you were to remove that whole chunk, the sentence would still remain the same. So with commas, interrupters always get commas around them, appositives always get commas around them, and relative clauses, there are two types of relative clauses. One type does and one type doesn't. So if we look down here, On the right column, we have the non-restrictive clause, which is a type of relative clause, and then the appositive and the interrupter. So this whole right column needs commas around it, and this restrictive clause, the other type of relative clause, does not need a comma. So the restrictive and the non-restrictive clause are just clauses that start with one of these verbs. I forgot to put which in here, but which is included in there. So who, that, whose, where, when, or which, those are all relative clauses. So let's look at where you need a comma versus where you don't. So a restrictive clause describes the noun that it's talking about in a restrictive way, in a way that defines the noun that it's talking about. So this type of clause does not need commas because the extra information, the information provided by the restrictive clause, is essential for the meaning of the sentence. If I read this as it is, people who live in Minnesota are passive-aggressive. This who live in Minnesota is telling us what people we're talking about, who we're talking about. It's describing or defining the noun that we're talking about. So if I were to take this out, so if I group it off with commas, that means I can get it out or take it out without changing the meaning of the sentence. If we did that over here, the sentence's meaning would change. If I read people who live in Minnesota are passive-aggressive, that's much different than people are passive-aggressive, because there's 7 billion people. This is much more vague, saying people are passive-aggressive than identifying the group of people that we're talking about, the people who live in Minnesota. On the other side of that, if we have a non-restrictive clause, we do put commas because this is additional information that isn't essential to the meaning of the sentence. So in this case, this phrase right here isn't defining that in a restrictive way versus over here it was. If I were to read, Chuck, who lives in Minnesota, is passive-aggressive, that is the same thing as Chuck is passive-aggressive, because we already know who we're talking about. We're talking about Chuck. In this case, it was people, and we didn't know what type of people we were talking about. But in this case, we know who we're talking about. We're talking about Chuck. So this who lives in Minnesota is extra information, which means that if we took it out, the sentence wouldn't change its meaning. We're still saying that Chuck is passive-aggressive. Having this non-restrictive clause just adds the additional information. So hopefully that made sense. The last thing I'll say is that on the ACT, if you see the verb that with a relative clause, that always means that it's restrictive. So that will never have commas sectioning it off. Versus which corresponds to a non-restrictive clause. So that will always have commas. So if we look at two examples here, having that is restrictive because, so if this is our restrictive clause, that walked on the moon, the turtle that walked on the moon never returned, is much different than the turtle never returned. Removing this changes the meaning of the sentence, so we don't want to have commas. Over here with the which, we can take out this part between the commas and it will retain the same meaning. So if our sentence is saying Mount Everest is around 28,000 feet, that's the same thing as Mount Everest, which is the tallest mountain on Earth, is 28,000 feet. That's just extra information, so we have to section it off with commas. And if we were to remove what was between the commas, we just saw that the sentence would have the same meaning that it did before. So hopefully that's clear. Moving on to appositives and interrupters, these are also sectioned off with commas. The only difference is that they don't have these verbs that start them off. So looking at an appositive example, if we take the exact same sentence but change this from a non-restrictive clause to an appositive phrase, instead of which is the tallest mountain on Earth, now we just have the tallest mountain on Earth. So Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth, is 28,000 feet. That's the same thing as Mount Everest is around 28,000 feet. Same idea. Moving on to interrupters, those are just a shortened versions of appositive. So sometimes it's just one single transition word, like we have here. Jim, however, remained unconvinced. So that's just one single transition word, and if you took it out, the sentence would have the same meaning. Jim remained unconvinced. So interrupters can actually take a lot of different forms besides just transition words. So in this case, we actually have a name. Sometimes it's the narrator turning to the audience and saying something. That's sometimes sectioned off with commas. But with this one, if you removed Jeff, that would have the same meaning as Michael's stepdad was hard to get along with. This Jeff just provides additional information. So the bottom line, basically the takeaway is that anytime you have extra information, you should always have it sandwiched between two commas. And then the last thing I'll say doesn't really have to do with commas, but you can put in a positive phrase both between two commas and between two dashes. Works the exact same way. All right, here we have number 49, an example of the appositive phrase. So I actually couldn't find one for the restrictive versus non-restrictive clause, but everything I saw said that you needed to know that, so I guess there's that. But looking at number 49, I want you to do this on your own if you want to, and then come back. So ready, set, pause. Awesome. So looking at number 49, we have a comma here and a comma here, which sets off or demarcates our appositive phrase. So this right here, this whole line right here, is our actual appositive phrase. And if we were to remove that, it would have the same meaning as the original sentence or the actual sentence that says the Aurelian wall was sturdier than the older wall. That built in the late 3rd century is just additional information. So we want to leave it no change because the other options don't take into account the second comma over here that indicates that we would need the first one for the appositive phrase. So 49 is A.
And then if you want to do this example on your own, go ahead. All right, and then the last thing I'll say about interrupters is that, so sometimes you'll see them and they're transition words such as however or therefore or any of these. But usually the ACT doesn't test you on comma rules in these instances. Usually it's about what type of transition word or which transition word fits best with the rest of the flow of the paragraph.
Moving on to separating two independent clauses. So if you have a sentence with two independent clauses, two things that could stand on their own as sentences, you can separate them in one of 4 ways. You can just add a period after the first one and capitalize the second one. You can add a semicolon, and sometimes you see a conjunctive adverb after the semicolon. So you could have a semicolon and then have a however or meanwhile or likewise or also or anyway, something like that after the semicolon and then a comma. Third way, you could have a colon divide up two independent clauses. And then the fourth way, and the one that has to do with commas, is a comma and then a fanboys conjunction. So a fanboys conjunction is for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or so. The ACT tests quite often on putting these after sentences or not, or which cases you do or don't do that. The thing to remember is just to separate two independent clauses, you could do one of these 4 things, but if you choose this one, you have to have a comma and you have to have a fanboys conjunction. You can't just have a comma. You can't just have a fanboys conjunction. You can't have a comma and then a conjunctive adverb like a comma and then a however. That doesn't work either. You have to have a comma and a fanboys conjunction. So let's look at a few examples.
All right, looking at 62, work it out on your own. So ready, set, pause. Okay, coming back. 62 is essentially asking us to divide up this independent clause. So Jones even fudges her date of birth. That's its own independent clause that could stand on its own as a sentence. And the second independent clause, she falsely lists May 1st and ages herself by nearly a decade. That could be its own sentence as well. So how should we divide up these two? Well, if you remember back 10 seconds ago when I said you can divide it up 4 ways, with physically separating the two with a period, putting a semicolon, putting a colon, or putting a comma in a fanboys conjunction. So let's apply that to 62. So what it is right now, we have the comma, but we don't have the coordinating conjunction, the fanboys conjunction, which is why F would be incorrect. If we look at G, a colon does separate two independent clauses, so let's keep that in mind. H, we have the semicolon, but it also deletes this she right here. That she right here is very important to the second independent clause because that's the subject of the second independent clause. And if I take away the subject, now that clause is no longer independent. That couldn't stand on its own. If I read, falsely lists May 1st, International Workers' Day, and ages herself by nearly a decade, that is no longer its own sentence. That couldn't stand on its own. But if we had, she falsely lists May 1st and ages herself by nearly a decade, now we can have that own independent clause. But this one is separating, now it's not separating two independent clauses because it deletes the she, which is why that one is wrong. And then if we look at J, we would have Jones even fudges her date of birth, falsely listing colon. So this colon would indicate that this whole thing is its own independent clause. And if we read that, May 1st, International Workers' Day, and ages herself by nearly a decade, that's not its own clause. That's why that one's wrong. So finally, by process of elimination, we have G, and also G is grammatically correct because it has the colon separating the two, and it didn't delete the she. So there you go.
And then if you want to, there's another one about dividing up two independent clauses, number 64. So pause the video and work that one out if you'd like. Otherwise, we'll keep moving. Parentheses and commas. So the rule with this is you never put one before parentheses, never put one before this opening one, because this opening one kind of acts as its own comma almost. But bottom line, never put one before a pair of parentheses. Never put a comma before parentheses. On the other hand, on the right side, after the parentheses, you sometimes need a comma and you sometimes don't. So the cases that you do is that if I remove this whole parentheses from the rest of the sentence, if I would need a comma there anyway, if I removed this, then you do need a comma after the parentheses. If you wouldn't, after removing what's in the parentheses, if you wouldn't need a comma in the actual sentence, then you don't need a comma after the parentheses. All right, if we look at 32, try this one on your own. So ready, set, pause. Okay, so 32 is asking which of the options isn't grammatically correct. So if we look at F, we have an appositive phrase sectioned off with two dashes. If we look at G, we have an appositive phrase sectioned off with two commas. Both of those are just fine, so we can get rid of those. So now we're between H and J. And if you remember back from 5 seconds ago when I said never put a comma before the opening side of a pair of parentheses, we can eliminate H, and our answer is J. The other thing I said was that there's an optional comma on the right side of a pair of parentheses. You only need the comma if you would need the comma in the sentence without the parentheses. So if we read this without this whole thing, would we need a comma without that? So Quezada found shards of pots painted with intricate red and black designs. Nope, doesn't need a comma. So J is also right because there's no comma after that right side of the pair of parentheses, and there isn't one here either.
Next is reflexive pronouns. So those are just itself, himself, themselves, herself, all of those. If those are directly adjacent to, right next to the noun or the antecedent that they're actually describing, you don't put commas around the pronoun. So at 67, we have she herself adopted the name blah, 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 blah. That herself is describing the she. It's directly next to the she. We don't put any commas, so the answer would be D. This type of question doesn't come up too often, but it comes up often enough. So there you go.
All right, moving on to lists. So commas divide up lists of 3 or more nouns, verbs, phrases, independent clauses, anything like that. So for example, I went to the store and bought A, B, and C. Or I met John, we went to the bar, and afterwards we went home. Or the dog jumped, turned, flipped, and then went into space. Something like that. You would have commas dividing up everything. But if I had two things, if I said I went to the store to buy milk and cereal, you wouldn't have a comma between the milk and the cereal because it's just 2 items. It's not 3 or more items. But with adjectives, you do need a comma between 2 of them. So if I said I crossed the big empty street, you would have a comma between big and empty. Or I crossed the big empty street with a strange tall man. Strange and tall would also have a comma in between them. So 2 or more adjectives or 3 or more nouns, verbs, phrases, independent clauses, anything like that. The thing I'll say with adjectives, so put a big asterisk right there, is that sometimes you actually don't need a comma between 2 or more adjectives.
So there are 2 types of adjectives, the cumulative adjective and the coordinate adjective. So the cumulative adjective does not need a comma, but the coordinate adjective does need a comma. You don't need to remember what the names of those are. The thing to remember is this. So if I have 2 or more adjectives, they are separated with a comma if I switch the 2 adjectives, the meaning of the sentence remains the same, and or if I put an and between the 2 adjectives, the meaning is still the same. So if we look at 71, does this need a comma or does it not need a comma? When the need for smaller, quicker vessels changed sail design, he adapted. So that's our sentence. The 2 adjectives we have are smaller and quicker. So our rule was you do need a comma if you can switch their order and they remain meaning the same thing, or if you put an and between them, it also remains the same. So if I said when the need for smaller and quicker vessels changed sail design, that retains the same meaning. And if I switch the two adjectives, I reverse them. When the need for quicker, smaller vessels changed sail design, that also makes sense. So we do need a comma for 71. That's no change.
All right, looking at number 5, try it on your own. Ready, set, pause. Cool. So coming back, they have a comma between intensive and field. So those are both next to this noun studies. So they separated it with a comma. So they're saying we should be able to flip-flop them or put an and between them, and it should mean the same thing. So if I said, as it is, intensive field studies, if I flip-flop them, it would say field intensive studies, which is completely different than an intensive field study, because a field study, you can kind of think about it this way. A field study is kind of its own thing on its own. So another example, you would have like field study or gold medal or Great Barrier Reef. Those are all almost their own nouns, and then these adjectives out here are describing that whole noun. So if I said barrier Great Reef, that would mean something completely different than the Great Barrier Reef, which we all know and love. So field study is almost its own noun, and intensive is describing the field study. So switching the two definitely wouldn't make sense, saying field intensive study versus intensive field study. So our answer in this case is B, because it doesn't have the comma between intensive and field, like D or A. And the reason that it isn't C is because C has this comma right here, and it doesn't need a comma at this part after studies, because this whole thing that I underlined right here, that whole thing is our subject, and that right there, that is our verb. So the whole subject is a key finding from her intensive field studies, and then the verb is. So separating the subject and the verb with a comma is something that you shouldn't do. So we leave the comma out. So C is also incorrect. So our answer is B. All right, number 15, try it on your own. Ready, set, pause. Okay, coming back. Number 15 is hard because we have a 2-item list, but the items are a lot longer than saying milk, eggs, and bananas. The items we have here are results of her labor, and then the second item is and of the fire's magic. So we have 2 items in a list, and they're not adjectives, so we would not have a comma separating the two. So in this case, it would be no change for the express purpose that we just have 2 items, however long and cumbersome they are. We still only have 2 items, so we don't put a comma there. The ACT tries to trick students a lot with that one, so watch out for that. Okay, real quick, last up we have dates and location. So I couldn't find any questions on this from the 5 ACTs that I actually looked at, but a lot of the stuff I saw said that you do need to know where the commas go for this. So I'll just give a real quick kind of spiel for this. So you do put a comma after the actual day. So if today is like September 23rd, comma, and then you have the year. You put the comma after, you don't put a comma after the month, you put a comma after the day, and then you have the year. And then with location, you put a comma after the city and the state, or the state and the country. So Minneapolis, comma, Minnesota, or Ann Arbor, comma, Michigan, something like that. All right, video number 1, finally done. So comma rules, probably the most annoying or cumbersome grammatical rule you could learn, because there's so much stuff you can do with commas. They're just like all over the place. So if that was really long, I'm sorry. In the future, they'll be much easier to understand, hopefully, and hopefully a lot shorter. But there you go. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Hopefully that helped. Good luck whenever you take your ACT.